Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. I am your host, Eric Worrell. Steve is off today. He's in the office, but he's got some stuff he's got to take care of. So I'm going to be taking the reins on this episode. And this is episode number 235. And we're going to be talking about some recent stories in the news from the last week that affect landlords and real estate investors. And as the title suggests, we have a pretty interesting topic that actually is coming from Forbes that we're going to be talking about an unprecedented affordability crisis and some pretty shocking statistics on what renters can afford and what's happening right now in the U.S. rental markets. We'll get that and a couple other stories that we're going to get to, but why don't we roll some of that sweet intro music first?
1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
I always feel weird when the intro kind of tees it up and talks about Steve and me being here, and then it's just me. It kind of makes me feel lonely, you know? It's just Eric. There's no co-host. It's just the host. That's okay, though. We got some good stuff going on here at Rent Prep. That's why Steve's busy. We actually have been pretty busy lately onboarding property managers. We do a lot of work with property managers, doing credit checks for them, setting them up in our system where we can actually have specialized services that we offer just specifically for property managers who manage 50 or more units. So if that's somebody like yourself, be sure to check us out. You can call us, email us, however you want to reach out to us at RentPrep, but we could be of help and service to you. So the first story I want to start off with, I want to get to the first story that's the juiciest. This one comes from Forbes.com, and the author is Pedro Nicolasi de Costa, and the title of it is U.S. Renters Face Unprecedented Affordability Crisis. He goes on to say that the Americans renters are struggling with a toxic mix of rising rents and stagnant wages that's generating an unprecedented affordability crisis, leaving more than half of households in a precarious financial state. So according to this article here, 51% of renters nationally pay more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities. Now, that is the line that really stuck out to me from this article. This article was just published on November 23rd. And yeah, that stat just was eye-popping to me because a lot of our clients use a 30% rent-to-income ratio. And if you're new to being a landlord, basically what that is your income and your rent. You do not want your rent to exceed 30% of your total gross income. So according to this article, just slightly over 50%, 51% to be exact, of renters are spending more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities. Now, I know that most landlords don't include utilities on that, so that is a little bit skewed, but that's pretty staggering. To me, the takeaway from a landlord perspective, of course, this article is talking about the issues that renters are facing, and there is a stagnation. It's not a secret that wages haven't risen a lot in the U.S. in the last few decades, as opposed to inflation and other things. But from a landlord, if you're looking at this, you got to realize that possibly 50% of the people coming to look at your apartment, all depends on where you live and where the location is, but 50% of renters are spending 30% or more of their income on rent and utilities. So that's why it's extremely important to be asking that question and making sure that you're making it part of your screening criteria of what your rent to income ratio is. And 30% is usually the standard. Some people will do 25%, but 30% is a pretty good rent to income ratio. So another quick one that people will do is you must make 3 times the rent. That's kind of similar to saying like 33%. That's a little bit more aggressive if you want somebody's gross income to be 3 times the rent to be considered for your rental property. 30% is a little bit less aggressive. But if you're going lower than that, you really are creating an issue for yourself as the landlord because, obviously if this person's spending more than 30% of their income on rent, it could be hard for them to pay for rent someday if, the car breaks down or they have other things that happen in life. So that's why that's in place. But it's kind of a scary statistic. This is saying that for low income renters and renters of color, particularly women of color, are mostly squeezed by the crisis. The council estimates more than 3/4 of lower income households pay too much for rent, and 6 in 10 women of color who are head of households pay too much for rent compared compared with 4 in 10 white men. Among a range of statistics, the group cited a new Zillow analysis showing that 42% of rental listings were within financial reach for a median income U.S. household, just 16% for median Black family and income, and 27% for median Latino household. So, all those statistics are going to, affect you differently depending on where you are, where your location of your rentals are. But, this is where kind of that term disparate impact kind of comes in. We've seen it with criminal records, but this article is obviously making the nexus or the connection that this rental crisis is not equally affecting every ethnic group, where Latinos and Black men, especially women, are being affected even worse by this rental crisis. So, again, not to be harsh about it, because I do think this article is bringing to light, a sensitive topic that is affecting people in the United States and in our communities. But from a landlord's perspective, just be consistent, have your rent to income ratio standard, and stick with that. And then, it's not your job as the landlord to fix the economy, unfortunately. It's your job to find out if your rental is appropriately priced for your neighborhood, and then stick to your screening criteria to make sure that you get good tenants in. A good tenant isn't somebody of a specific color or race. A good tenant is somebody who pays rent on time and has a good rental history. And that's what you want to stick to, and that's what your criteria is all about. So make sure you have that screening criteria, because that's going to come in handy if you ever face any kind of accusations of discrimination. And the reason I say that is that segues nicely into our next article. This one comes from OregonLive.com. And this was published on November 21st. And this one says that Portland housing audits find renters still face discrimination. So occasionally Portland comes up in the news here because there is a lot of back and forth on what's going on there. It is a very progressive, very pro-tenant friendly city, where I know there's a lot of things like if you evict a tenant, you may have to pay for their moving costs, or there's just a lot of different programs set up to make it tenant friendly. And part of the reason is that the rents were getting to a point where tenants couldn't afford to live there anymore. So that all aside, this particular article is saying that immigrants and people of color continue to face discrimination in Portland's white-hot rental market, years after city officials committed to end housing discrimination. So undercover testing found landlords gave worse treatment to immigrant and non-white renters about 25% of the time, according to results published Tuesday by the Portland Housing Bureau. Immigrant renters were given disparate treatment most often, the results show. So again, disparate treatment just meaning that one ethnic class or group is being unfairly discriminated against. Disproportionately is what the disparate treatment means. The figure reinforces a 2011 city audit and subsequent fair housing test that found Black, Latino, and disabled renters faced widespread discrimination in Portland. Mayor Ted Wheeler, who is the city housing commissioner, said in a statement Tuesday that city officials will work hard to remedy the problem. So the results from the fair housing report indicate something we have been working to remedy locally and in our nation, an inherited history of discrimination. I think we can all agree that we have further to go. So that's kind of coming from the mayor there. But I'll scan ahead here for you. The interesting thing is that this article breaks down those fair housing audits. So I'm sure a landlord is interested in hearing how that works. Basically, what they do is the fair housing audits work by sending trained actors to seek rental housing. A white actor will pose as a renter, as will a person who belongs to a protected class, a person of color, immigrant, disabled person, and so on. They separately seek the same rental housing and compare results for preferential treatment. For the latest test, initial results found that white renters were given preference in 9 of 45 cases, which is pretty high. I mean, you're talking close to 20%. The Fair Housing Council of Oregon, which conducted the audit, did additional testing at 12 of 45 sites where the initial results were inconclusive and found 4 more instances of discrimination. So the Fair Housing Council also operates a housing discrimination hotline, and calls from March 2016 to November 2017, nearly 25% reported racial discrimination and 37% complained of discrimination based on disability. Results suggest renters who are immigrants or people of color are far more likely to be quoted a higher price for rent and security deposit than white counterparts. Like that right there is just ridiculous. If you're going to charge a higher security deposit, it has to be because somebody didn't meet your screening criteria. You can have a conditional response to that where, you can have it set up in your screening criteria that if you don't meet these certain thresholds, that they will be issued adverse action, and that is conditional adverse action. And you have to spell it out to them and explain why that the security deposit is going to be more. And that's because you didn't meet my 650 credit criteria. So this is a conditional adverse action, which is one of the free forms we have if you're a rent prep client. And you need to spell that out and make sure that the person is aware. That in that case, if somebody, is creating a housing discrimination claim against you and they're saying, I am being discriminated against because of XYZ, and they're charging me a higher security deposit because of that, that's what you do is you point to the adverse action notice that you gave them. So a lot of people think that adverse action, if you're not familiar with that, what that is when you deny somebody or you have conditional requirements for them, such as a higher security deposit, you must issue adverse action. A lot of people don't do this in general, but definitely a lot of them don't do it for the higher security deposit. So if you're using that form and you're issuing that, if you have a discrimination claim against you, you point to that form and you say, no, this is my screening criteria. And then the reason the security deposit was higher was because they didn't meet my initial screening criteria. And this is a conditional, adverse action that I issued to them. So you definitely want to make sure you're doing that. So results suggest that the renters who are immigrants or people of color are far more likely to be quoted that higher price, as I was mentioning. So that kind of discrimination is illegal, obviously. The U.S. Fair Housing Act bans giving preference to housing based on race, national origin, religion, sex, family status, and disability. You'll notice too earlier in this article in Oregon, it was talking about immigration status too. That is something that's being considered more and more specifically in regions. I know in Buffalo, that's something where you cannot discriminate against somebody based on immigration status. So that's why it's important to know what your local law is and what the federal law is on the U.S. Fair Housing Act as well. So I'll just read this last little bit to you because this is interesting. Landlords who discriminate can be subject to fines and lawsuits, but enforcement is rare because officials may be reluctant to crack down on the powerful real estate industry, and few lawyers take on the cases. I thought that was interesting. I've never heard that before. It says that many renters do not report housing discrimination because they do not know it's unlawful. I can tell you that may be true, but that's only going to become less and less true over time. So take emotional support animals, for example. That was a loophole for many renters who wanted to sneak a pet in. Some people legitimately need a emotional support animal, but we also know that there's a lot of renters who just, are trying to sneak a pet in. They don't want to pay a pet deposit, and they don't care that you have a no pet policy, which you should be calling it no animal policy, or at least using the word animal instead of pets in your disclaimers and in your vocabulary as a landlord or property manager. If you don't know what I'm talking about there, check out our emotional support animal podcast we did with Jamie Kane. But when those first came out, there wasn't many people that knew about them. And now you look 2-3 years down the line, there's tons of renters that know that, you just, emotional support animal, get an ESA letter, you're fine. So these things, word spreads. So right now, if tenants aren't aware that it's of how to report discrimination or that discrimination is illegal, it's only going to become more prevalent and more understood by people, and it should be, because it's something that they shouldn't have to deal with. It shouldn't have to curb neighborhoods or change the way that people live because of discrimination. So it's a good thing that people are becoming more aware of it, and it's going to make landlords be more on their game and understand what the laws are and make sure they're abiding by it. So yeah, I just thought it was a pretty interesting article. It does point out that the city is trying to do more. She pointed to her bureau's announcement that it will make a $200,000 available for nonprofits to provide legal aid for enforcement against bad landlords. So they are doing things to make it easier for people to get legal representation paid for in that city. So, like I said, it's a very pro-tenant city due to the fact that it's a very hot rental market. So landlords are making really good money out there based on the appreciation of the rents, but at the same time, they deal with a lot of issues with the tenants and everything they have going on. So This last story comes from abc13.com, which is in Houston, Texas. And this is from Sunday, November 25th. And this one just kind of caught my attention. It was a kind of a strange story. And the title says, "That's not ours." A pastor says hidden game room that firefighters found in the church building isn't his. So let me read this one to you because there's a few things to kind of peel back here. And there's definitely a landlord lesson tucked inside too. So firefighters were called to report of a fire inside of a house of worship in North Harris County that uncovered instead more than 100 gambling machines. So crews were called to the 800 block of Turney Drive at around 7:30 p.m. Friday for a reported fire at the World of Life Church. So the firefighters arrived to find no signs of a fire. However, the person who reported the incident said he was locked in by an electronic door lock. Crews made their way to the church where they revealed a large gaming room. So Harris County Sheriff's deputies were called to the scene where they took several people out of the building in handcuffs. The sheriff's office said it was interviewing people regarding the gaming room. One person was arrested on an outstanding warrant. So basically you have this church set up, and for some reason somebody called and reported that there was a fire happening at the church. But when the firefighters got there was no fire, but they found 100 gaming machines. So the pastor of the church said that the church shares the building with another business. One side of the building is the World of Life Church, and the other business is its own separate entity. Scott, who is the pastor, said that he and his church couldn't afford the entire building, so the landlord put a wall that separates the church from the other side of the building. He also says he has no idea who the manager of the other side is and has little to no information about the business they run. An investigation into the game room, including its legality, is underway. So I know what you're probably thinking. You're like, what is going on? Like, it's a weird situation, right? And I'm wondering how the landlord handled it, because he probably had a tenant that said, "Hey, I can't afford to pay you the rent anymore." So the landlord thinks, okay, like, let me just put a wall up in the middle of this building and I'm going to rent out to somebody else on the other side. Well, I find it strange that the pastor doesn't know who that is on the other side, right? You'd think there'd just be some sort of understanding, since you're sharing the same roof of the entire building that you used to inhabit on your own. But I wonder how the landlord went about setting that wall up and where these gaming machines, how those got in there. I'm pretty sure that's an illegal act, since the sheriffs are getting involved. So you're wondering kind of what the landlord did as far as screening these new tenants and what the legal implications are all around for this. So I'll read a little bit more. It says that in an effort to clarify and confirm his church or their relationship with the other business, the pastor posted a 15-minute video to his Facebook page explaining that he gave a tour of the facility where they were electronically locked doors he said he had never had access to. I can just imagine, though, that this was probably a pretty tough situation. I mean, you talk about renting to friends, right? You shouldn't be renting to your friends. Well, part of the issue with renting to friends, and I've dealt with this before, is it feels weird when you have to crack down on them, whether it's for late rent or, maybe it's a noise complaint issue or something like that. It feels weird because then you're like, well, I'm the landlord hat now that I'm wearing, and I know I was wearing the friend hat a couple weeks ago when we were hanging out. But this must have been a tough situation where the church comes to the landlord and says they can't afford the rent. And now the landlord, who wants to evict, a pastor of a church? That's not a great look, right? So it sounds like the landlord's got a sticky situation. Hopefully they're not going to be in any trouble and it's just on the tenant. But yeah, screen your tenants. Yeah, don't try to budge on your rents and just throw up a random temporary wall. And then all of a sudden there's these, electronic locked doors that people didn't have access to. I don't know the full story of why somebody was calling from inside those doors and claiming there was a fire. I don't see why you just couldn't call and, tell the police something else to get them there. But also, yeah, don't call about fake fires. Firefighters are there for a reason, to fight fires. Don't make a fake call to get them to come in. And, maybe there was a fire across town that they couldn't get to as quickly because of that. That's kind of ridiculous too. But as far as housing and rental markets, Houston is one of the largest in the country. If I'm not mistaken, I think it is the largest rental market in the United States. I'm sure somebody will correct me on that if I'm wrong. But I just thought that was an interesting story. The main takeaway is, don't budge on your rents with your tenants. Don't start like adding an extra room or like partitioning off walls and stuff like that so they can make their rents. just have the uncomfortable conversations and figure out what you're going to do. And you can budge if you want. You can say, you know what, that's fine. You can pay me less. That's up to you. There's no laws. It is a business. You want to treat it as one. But if you want to, help somebody out, you're more than welcome to do that. But don't help them out by having a shady business move into the same building with them. That's not a great situation to be in. So. And I should mention that I'm looking forward to next week. We have a special guest, Elizabeth Faircloth, on the podcast. She is part of the Tandem Group. Elizabeth and her husband, Matt, are of DeRosa Group. If you happen to catch my Facebook Live interview with Matt, DeRosa Group, they've done over $30 million in private equity deals. And Matt wrote the book called Raising Private Capital by Bigger Pockets. And Elizabeth has her own podcast, and she's been involved with real estate for a few decades now, and she's going to be on the podcast sharing her insights, her story of how she got started and what real estate investing has done for her and her family, and just kind of pulling any kind of insights and tips that we can from our time with Elizabeth on the podcast next week. So be sure to check that out when that comes through next week. Well, that does it for this week, and hope you're having a great December so far. And stay warm if you're in the northern climates like we are, and we look forward to catching up with you guys next week. All right, take care.